The prominent manager of the establishment, a woman whose professional authority was defined by an anxious need for absolute perfection, gripped the edge of the reservation podium until her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. She leaned closely toward the young woman standing before her, lowering her voice to a sharp whisper that barely cut through the ambient melody of the grand piano, echoing from the far side of the dining room. There was an unspoken terror in her eyes as she pointed a manicured finger toward the secluded corner table of the dining room. "No one in this entire establishment possesses the ability to communicate with her," the manager muttered, her voice trembling with a mixture of irritation and dread. "Not a single person on our staff has succeeded, and I have very little reason to believe that you will fare any better, Valerie." Valerie Reynolds adjusted the crisp white linen apron around her waist, her slender fingers shaking slightly as she absorbed the weight of the warning. At 26 years old, she had spent 2 full years navigating the demanding, high-pressure environment of the Avery, the most exclusive fine dining restaurant in the historic heart of Boston, Massachusetts. The establishment was a sanctuary of old-money elegance, where the cost of a single multi-course dinner easily equaled 2 full weeks of Valerie's modest wages. Throughout her tenure, she had maintained an immaculate record, never once committing a grave error or drawing the ire of the wealthy patrons who frequented the candlelit room. Yet on this particular autumn evening, as she gazed across the expanse of linen-draped tables and glittering crystal chandeliers, an unfamiliar sensation settled deep within her chest. It was an intuitive certainty that her life was about to alter its course, though she could not yet discern whether the outcome would be a professional catastrophe or something entirely transcendent. The individual seated at the isolated corner table was not merely a wealthy customer. She was Catherine Montgomery, the 74-year-old matriarch of one of the most influential families in New England. She sat with an effortless, regal posture that spoke of decades spent in elite academic and cultural circles. Her snow-white hair styled into an elegant chignon that caught the soft amber glow of the wall sconces. She wore an exquisite ivory cashmere sweater that likely cost more than the annual rent on Valerie's small apartment, and her delicate, aged wrists were adorned with a discreet gold timepiece. Her ears bore small, perfect pearl earrings that mirrored the quiet sophistication of her entire demeanor. She sat entirely motionless, surrounded by an invisible barrier of absolute silence, having lost her hearing completely and irreversibly exactly 8 years prior. Before Valerie had been handed the serving tray, 3 of the restaurant's most experienced waiters had already attempted to take Catherine's order, each failure more agonizing than the last. The first server had approached her with an exaggerated bravado, speaking at an incredibly high volume as if sheer vocal force could somehow pierce the veil of her profound deafness. Catherine had merely looked up at him with an infinite, weary patience, the expression of a woman who had grown profoundly tired of being treated as though her intelligence had departed along with her hearing. The second waiter had attempted to scribble options on a paper napkin, but his handwriting was an illegible scrawl, and the flimsy paper had crumpled awkwardly under his anxious grip. The third server had simply frozen in her presence, paralyzed by the sheer awkwardness of the encounter, before retreating to the kitchen with the most pathetic, stammering apology of the evening. Now, the burden of the elite family's satisfaction rested entirely on Valerie's shoulders. "Do not keep her waiting for another single minute," the manager urged, her whisper rising in pitch as her panic mounted. "She has been sitting at that table for 40 minutes without a single glass of water or an appetizer. If she decides to leave this restaurant tonight without dining, Raymond Montgomery will ensure that management faces immediate, severe consequences." The name of Raymond Montgomery carried an immense, unspoken authority throughout the city. At 41 years old, he was the sole heir to a massive international real estate and construction conglomerate, with a powerful presence across 7 different countries. He had purchased the Avery 3 years ago, not as a strategic financial investment, but as a sentimental whim, because his mother had casually mentioned that she enjoyed the historical architecture of the building. At that exact moment, Raymond Montgomery himself was seated at a large corporate table on the opposite side of the dining room, dressed in a flawless navy bespoke suit. He held a glass of expensive red wine in his right hand, his eyes entirely glued to the glowing screen of his smartphone as he reviewed global market reports. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his elderly mother had been sitting in total isolation for nearly an hour, unable to communicate even her most basic desire for a glass of water. Valerie took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs as she stepped away from the kitchen corridor and began her walk toward the corner table. What no one in the restaurant knew, not the anxious manager, not the elite culinary staff, and certainly not the wealthy owner checking his emails, was that Valerie had grown up in a household defined by a beautiful, silent language. Her younger sister, Grace, now 24, had been born profoundly deaf, and from the time Valerie was merely 4 years old, American Sign Language had not been a structured academic subject or a unique skill to be flaunted. It was simply the natural, emotional language of her home, spoken with the hands as fluidly as words were spoken with the mouth. When Valerie finally arrived at the edge of the quiet corner table, she did not speak aloud, nor did she shout or attempt to write on a piece of paper. She completely avoided the clumsy, exaggerated hand gestures and patronizing facial expressions that untrained individuals so often employ when attempting to communicate with a deaf person. Gestures that treat the individual like a lost tourist rather than an equal human being. Instead, Valerie placed her service tray onto the wooden side cart, stepped directly into Catherine's field of vision at a respectful distance, and waited patiently for the elderly woman's tired, downcast eyes to lift toward her. The moment their eyes met, Valerie raised her hands to the level of her chest, her fingers moving with a practiced, elegant precision. "Good evening, Mrs. Montgomery," she signed, her movements fluid and clean. "My name is Valerie, and I will be taking care of you tonight. May I assist you in selecting your dinner?" The brief interlude of time that elapsed between that initial movement of Valerie's hands and Catherine's internal realization lasted exactly 4 seconds. Valerie counted those seconds in the quiet spaces of her mind because, within that impossibly brief window, the entire bustling atmosphere of the crowded restaurant seemed to grind to an absolute halt. Then, an extraordinary transformation occurred that left the watching kitchen staff utterly spellbound. Catherine Montgomery, a woman who had spent 8 long years carrying her profound deafness like a heavy, isolating sentence, blinked rapidly. She was a woman who had spent nearly a decade straining her eyes to read lips, with a precision that had cost her countless tears of frustration. A woman who had grown painfully accustomed to being the invisible, decorative participant at family gatherings and high-powered corporate dinners, where everyone laughed at jokes she would never hear. As she witnessed the flawless American Sign Language flowing from Valerie's hands, Catherine's eyes widened in absolute astonishment, and a magnificent smile bloomed across her face. It was not the polite, superficial smile of social obligation that she routinely wore in public to ensure she did not make her son's wealthy associates feel uncomfortable. It was a radiant, profoundly genuine expression of pure joy, resembling the look of an exhausted traveler who had been hopelessly lost in a foreign country for years, only to suddenly hear a stranger speaking her native tongue in a crowded marketplace. Catherine's own delicate hands rose into the air, trembling with a sudden surge of deep emotion as she signed back. "Do you truly know how to sign? Is this real?" "Yes, Mrs. Montgomery," Valerie responded immediately, her hands moving with a warmth and assurance that required no spoken words. "It is entirely real. I am here to talk with you." Around their isolated table, the frantic energy of the busy restaurant continued unabated. The low murmur of corporate conversations, the sharp clinking of crystal wine glasses, and the soft, melancholic notes of the live piano music floating through the air. All of it remained precisely the same, yet at that small corner table, the invisible barrier of isolation had been shattered. It was as if a heavy, stained glass window that had been tightly sealed for 8 years had suddenly been unlocked, allowing a rush of fresh, invigorating air to flood into a dark room. Catherine eagerly requested to see the evening menu, and Valerie took the time to explain every single culinary option in vivid, expressive signs. She detailed each dish ingredient by ingredient, demonstrating a profound patience that made it seem as though they had all the time in the world, completely ignoring the 20 other tables requiring attention in the dining room. The elegant matriarch asked nuanced questions about the flavor profiles, and Valerie answered with expressive movements of her hands and face. At one point, Catherine signed a clever, highly visual joke that utilized a subtle play on signs, and Valerie let out a genuine, clear laugh that escaped her lips before she could think to suppress it. It was that precise sound of heartfelt laughter that finally caused Raymond Montgomery to look up from his phone on the other side of the room. He raised his eyes, expecting to see an old family friend greeting his mother, but instead, he beheld a young waitress in a simple apron, her hands moving through the air with a mesmerizing grace, while his mother responded with an animated, vibrant energy he had not witnessed in nearly a decade. Raymond slowly placed his phone face down on the table, and he did not touch it again for the rest of the evening. From his distant vantage point at the back of the dining room, Raymond Montgomery watched the silent conversation unfold for 45 minutes. He left his expensive glass of wine half-finished and ignored the dessert he had previously ordered, completely captivated by the sight of the young waitress connecting with his mother. He watched them share stories, noting the way his mother gesticulated with an uncharacteristic excitement, her facial expressions shifting from deep contemplation to bright amusement. For 8 years, Catherine had worn a mask of polite exhaustion, but tonight, that mask had completely vanished. Raymond felt a strange, heavy sensation tighten within his chest, a feeling he could not immediately identify. It was not pride, nor was it simple gratitude, though a portion of that existed. It felt far more like a profound, aching sense of shame, a sudden and sharp realization that something immensely important had been missing from his mother's life for an incredibly long time, and he had done absolutely nothing to remedy her isolation. Meanwhile, Valerie returned to the kitchen area to wait for the culinary staff to prepare Catherine's dinner, entirely unaware that the powerful owner of the conglomerate had been analyzing her every move. She did not know that within 15 minutes, when she stepped back out into the dining room, carrying the beautifully plated salmon entree, Raymond would no longer be seated at his distant table. Instead, he was standing directly in the narrow, dimly lit service corridor that connected the kitchen to the main dining area, his hands tucked into his pockets and a complex expression on his face that hovered between intense fascination and corporate authority. "You are the first individual outside of my personal medical team who has spoken to my mother in her own language in over 3 years," Catherine signed to Valerie as the young woman carefully arranged the plate of salmon on the table. The phrase did not enter Valerie's ears. It entered her visual consciousness through the stark, deliberate movements of the elderly woman's hands. Catherine signed with a fierce, independent determination that revealed she had learned the language late in life, but with a profound stubbornness. The sentiment was so direct, so entirely devoid of polite embellishment, that Valerie had to consciously tighten her grip on her serving tray to prevent herself from dropping it. 3 years, Valerie signed back in a low, discreet movement of her hands, her brow furrowing with genuine concern. 3 years, Catherine confirmed, a small, slightly cynical smile touching the corners of her lips. "My son hired a professional certified interpreter for me 4 years ago. She remained on our household staff for exactly 1 year. After that, Raymond reviewed the corporate ledgers and decided it was far too expensive to keep a full-time interpreter on the payroll. He concluded that it was much more practical and efficient for me to simply read lips." Valerie remained silent, carefully adjusting the silver utensils on the table, but her hands stayed resting within the field of conversation. She understood deeply, having been raised in a home with a deaf family member, that abruptly walking away or breaking visual contact during a signed conversation was far more insulting than interrupting a spoken sentence. Spoken words could be repeated, but the raw emotional expression of a face in the moment could never be replicated. "Do you truly enjoy reading lips, Mrs. Montgomery?" Valerie asked, her hands moving with a gentle curiosity. Catherine's facial expression provided all the answer Valerie required. It was a brief, ironic smile that carried years of hidden exhaustion. Reading lips, Catherine signed, is very much like attempting to understand the beautiful lyrics of a song by pressing your ear against a very thick stone wall. You can easily capture the heavy rhythm of the bass, and occasionally you might discern a single word, but you will never truly comprehend the poetry of the complete song. You spend every single moment wondering if what you thought you understood matches what the person actually said. Valerie nodded slowly, her heart aching for the woman's long-standing isolation. "My younger sister says the exact same thing," she signed back. "Grace is 24, and she has been deaf since the day she was born. She works at a specialized primary school, teaching young children how to find their own voices through their hands." The mention of Valerie's sister changed the entire dynamic of the interaction, shifting it from a standard service relationship into something deeply personal and equal. Catherine placed her fork down on the table and looked at Valerie with a profound, focused intensity. "You went through the effort to learn this entire language because of her?" Catherine signed, her movements slowing. "I grew up speaking it," Valerie replied simply. "In our small home, spoken English and sign language were treated as the exact same language. My mother, my father, and I, everyone signed while they spoke. It was never considered an extra chore or a special skill. It was just how we loved each other." Catherine stared at her in total silence for a long moment, before moving her hands with a deliberate slowness that, in the grammar of sign language, carried the weight of a long, heavy sigh. "How incredibly fortunate your sister is," she signed, her eyes misting over, "to be born into a family that loved her enough to never treat her deafness as a difficult problem that needed to be solved." Valerie did not immediately respond to that poignant statement, because she knew the words carried a specific, painful weight that was not abstract. The sentiment was aimed directly at the wealthy tycoon sitting across the room, and Catherine was acutely aware of it. The conversation continued to unfold over the next hour, extending far beyond the boundaries of standard restaurant protocol. Valerie knew that Mrs. Fowler, the anxious manager, was watching her from the front podium, her expression fluctuating wildly between nervous approval of the Montgomery family's satisfaction and deep professional discomfort over the unprecedented duration of the service. Yet Valerie also knew, with an absolute certainty that no training manual could ever teach, that walking away at that moment to tend to other tables would be a profound emotional abandonment. Catherine was sharing her true heart, an occurrence that had not happened for her in a very long time. The elderly woman shared fragments of her solitary life in the family's historic estate in Brookline, explaining that she had lived there largely alone since her husband passed away 12 years ago. Raymond visited her on occasional Sundays, but his mind was always occupied by international business. He had a long-term girlfriend, Irene Vance, a wealthy socialite who had never bothered to learn a single sign in 4 years of dating. During large family holiday dinners, Catherine explained that she was always seated at the head of the long dining table, smiling politely while everyone carried on loud, rapid conversations around her, treating her like a beautiful piece of antique furniture, to be respected, but never actually included. "Have you ever considered telling your son exactly how much this isolates you?" Valerie asked. Catherine's hands stopped completely, resting flat against the white linen tablecloth. In sign language, a sudden absence of movement is not a void. It is the manifestation of deep, heavy thought. "How exactly do I tell him?" she signed back. "Do I write him a formal letter or send him a brief text message? Raymond does not know how to sign, and when we attempt to communicate, he speaks rapidly while I strain to read his lips. He never truly knows if I understood him correctly, and I never know if what I perceived is what he actually meant. It is exactly like trying to speak to someone through a pane of very thick glass. You can see each other's faces perfectly, but you can never truly touch." Valerie felt a sharp pain tighten in the center of her chest. "He believes you are perfectly content with this arrangement." "Yes," Catherine signed with a serene resignation. "He believes I have adapted completely, That lip reading is an efficient solution to a minor inconvenience. He thinks a smile means everything is fine. What neither woman realized during that quiet exchange of hands was that Raymond Montgomery had been standing exactly 12 meters away in the shadows of the private corridor for the past 10 minutes. He had utilized the excuse of making an urgent business call, but in reality, he had moved to a spot where the architectural columns did not obstruct his view of the waitress's hands. He could not read American Sign Language. He had taken a very brief introductory course 8 years ago when his mother first lost her hearing, but he had quickly abandoned it. He remembered only a few basic signs, the signs for food, water, and thank you. Just enough to alleviate his initial guilt, but nowhere near enough to maintain a true conversation. Yet what he was witnessing tonight required absolutely no translation. He saw his mother's body language completely relaxed, her face alive with an emotional clarity he had assumed was gone forever. He saw the profound difference between a polite, obliging smile and the radiant joy of a human being who was finally being heard. When Valerie briefly raised her eyes and caught him staring from the shadows, her hands froze mid-sign. She recognized immediately, through his expensive attire and commanding posture, that this man was the true authority of the establishment. She finished her sign with a calm deliberation, leaned forward to assure Catherine that she would check on the status of her dessert, and turned toward the kitchen. Raymond had already vanished from the corridor, but his half-filled wine glass and his smartphone remained abandoned on his table, face down. The following morning at exactly 10 o'clock, Valerie was sitting in her small, 42-square-meter apartment in South Boston, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Her phone rang, displaying an unrecognized number. When she answered, the deep, authoritative voice on the other end was instantly recognizable. "This is Raymond Montgomery," the voice said, entirely skipping any polite pleasantries. "I obtained your personal contact information from the Human Resources Department this morning. I need to speak with you immediately. I can arrange to have a private car bring you to the corporate headquarters downtown, or I can meet you wherever you currently are, whatever you prefer." The offer was delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who was unaccustomed to hearing the word no. An hour later, Valerie found herself stepping out of an elevator onto the 17th floor of a luxury skyscraper overlooking the Boston Harbor. The corporate offices of the Montgomery Group were a marvel of modern architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a sweeping view of the water that likely cost millions of dollars. Raymond was waiting for her in a private executive conference room that lacked the traditional, intimidating long table. Instead, it was furnished with deep leather armchairs and a massive exotic plant in the corner. A space designed to feel casual while retaining an immense atmosphere of power. He wore a charcoal gray tailored suit without a tie, his jacket fitting perfectly. "I want to hire you on a full-time basis," Raymond said directly, stepping toward her the moment the door closed. "I want you to act as a personal companion and language partner for my mother. 4 hours every day, Monday through Friday, with a completely flexible schedule tailored to her needs. I am prepared to offer you triple the salary you currently earn at the restaurant." Valerie sat quietly in the leather armchair, refusing to let the staggering financial offer overwhelm her judgment. She looked directly into Raymond's intense eyes, her posture entirely straight. "No," she said clearly. Raymond's eyebrows rose in immediate, uncharacteristic surprise. The word "no" was clearly not an element he had factored into his business strategy. "May I ask why you are rejecting an incredibly lucrative position?" he asked, his tone curious rather than offended. "Because I already have a meaningful job at the restaurant," Valerie replied, "and because what occurred last night between your mother and me was not a professional service to be purchased. It was a genuine human conversation. There is a profound difference between the two." "I am fully aware of that," Raymond countered, leaning forward. "That is precisely why I am asking you to accept this role. My mother does not need a cold, detached corporate interpreter to translate legal documents. She needs real human connection. She has spent years trapped in an incredibly lonely silence, and you are the only person who has managed to break through that barrier. And why have you not taken the time to learn her language yourself, Mr. Montgomery? Valerie asked, the question cutting through the air with an absolute, uncompromising honesty. Raymond stiffened slightly, his shoulders hardening under his expensive suit jacket. I manage an international conglomerate, he said, his voice tightening. My daily schedule is planned down to the minute. It leaves me with virtually zero personal time. The introductory lessons can be completed entirely online, Valerie responded, her voice remaining perfectly calm. 20 minutes every single morning before you leave for the office. There are countless applications, video tutorials, and intensive weekend seminars available. If you truly desired to communicate with your mother, you could begin learning this very afternoon. Hiring a stranger to speak with her solves the convenient symptom of your guilt, but it does not fix the core problem of your relationship. Raymond stared at her in absolute silence, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the room. He was a billionaire tycoon who regularly negotiated massive mergers and corporate contracts across multiple continents. Yet he was currently being lectured on basic familial duty by a 26-year-old waitress. You are entirely correct, Raymond admitted quietly, after a long pause, his gaze dropping to the floor. It was an admission that surprised them both. And despite that fact, he continued, looking back up, I am still asking you to accept this position. Because while I commit myself to learning this language, and I give you my word that I will, my mother is 74 years old. She has spent 3 years completely alone in her own home, and every single day that passes in silence is a day that we can never recover for her. Valerie looked out the massive glass window at the blue expanse of Boston Harbor. She thought of Catherine sitting alone by the window of her mansion, and she felt her resolve softening. Does your mother know you are attempting to hire me? She asked. No, Raymond replied. Then we must ask her permission first, Valerie stated. And if she desires my presence, I will accept the job under one absolute condition. You will begin your personal sign language lessons this week, and you will personally demonstrate your linguistic progress to me every single time we meet. Raymond looked at her for a moment, before nodding his head in agreement. The historic Montgomery estate in Brookline was a grand, 4-level brick mansion surrounded by an expansive garden of ancient oak trees that had spent over 30 years growing without a single moment of haste. It was a property that exuded the type of quiet, institutional wealth that had absolutely no need to make noise. Valerie arrived on the following Friday morning at exactly 10 o'clock, having traveled via the subway and a local taxi. She was led through the pristine grounds by Lillian, a kind-faced woman of 50 who had managed the domestic household staff for decades. Catherine was waiting for her in the main morning room, seated in a high-backed armchair next to a massive bay window that overlooked the golden autumn foliage. The moment Valerie stepped into the room and raised her hands to sign a warm greeting, the elderly woman's face opened up like a rare flower, the heavy mask of isolation vanishing instantly. The initial 2 weeks of their arrangement were a period of pure, joyful discovery. Valerie learned that Catherine maintained a highly disciplined morning routine, waking at 7 o'clock to breakfast alone because Raymond always departed for his corporate office by 6:30. She spent her long mornings reading historical biographies, practicing intricate embroidery, and watching television programs with closed captions that frequently glitched, leaving her with absurd, meaningless sentences that she archived with a wonderful sense of dry humor. Yesterday, the television captions informed me that the governor had passed a new piece of legislation regarding the mandatory consumption of potato chips. Catherine signed to Valerie on their third afternoon, her face completely serious for exactly 4 seconds before she burst into a delightful, ringing laugh. Yet the grand mansion was not entirely a sanctuary of peace. Irene Vance, Raymond's long-term girlfriend, continued to visit the estate with a frequency that felt calculated. She typically arrived late in the afternoon, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors. Irene was a woman of 32 who possessed an innate understanding of social hierarchies, and she viewed Valerie's presence with an immediate, deep-seated resentment. Unable to comprehend the rapid, fluid sign language passing between Valerie and Catherine, Irene utilized a highly refined weapon: complete social invisibilization. She would sweep into the room, offer Catherine a highly exaggerated, superficial kiss on the cheek, and then completely ignore Valerie's existence, speaking loudly into her phone or addressing the domestic staff as if the chair Valerie occupied were entirely vacant. Does her absolute refusal to acknowledge your existence cause you distress? Catherine signed one afternoon after Irene had departed to the garden to take a call. Not in the slightest, Valerie responded genuinely. I find it fascinating that she expends such an incredible amount of energy to actively ignore me. True indifference requires no effort at all, but what she is doing requires immense calculation. On the Friday of their second week, Raymond arrived at the Brookline estate much earlier than usual. Valerie and Catherine were sitting together when they felt the distinct, heavy vibration of footsteps echoing through the hallway. Raymond stepped into the room, his tie slightly loosened. He kissed his mother on the forehead, and then, instead of speaking aloud, he turned directly toward Valerie. He raised his right hand, his fingers slightly stiff and trembling with an intense nervousness, and carefully executed the specific signs for a proper greeting. "Hello, Mother. I am learning," he signed. The movements were clumsy and lacked any semblance of natural grace, resembling the first awkward steps of a child learning to walk in a completely unfamiliar world, but the grammar was absolutely flawless. Catherine's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with a sudden, overwhelming torrent of tears as she witnessed her busy, distant son reaching out to her through the silence. She immediately signed back, her hands shaking. "Hello, my beautiful son." The heavy autumn rain did not arrive with a gentle warning on that particular Tuesday evening. It slammed against the grand brick mansion in Brookline with a sudden, violent fury, as if the dark New England sky had been hoarding its grief for months. The massive oak trees in the garden groaned under the weight of the wind, and the expansive glass windows of the second-floor sitting room turned completely dark, reflecting the amber glow of a single brass floor lamp. Valerie should have returned to her South Boston apartment hours ago, but her afternoon lesson with Raymond had extended far past its usual 45 minutes. He had arrived filled with nuanced questions about sentence structure, demonstrating a fierce, stubborn discipline that Valerie found increasingly moving. After Raymond had departed for an urgent dinner meeting, Catherine had quietly requested that Valerie remain with her to help organize her massive collection of vintage vinyl records, according to a completely unique system, not by chronological year or musical genre, but by pure human emotion. They created a column for melodies that produced an inexplicable sense of longing, a column for songs that made one desire to dance even in an empty room, and a final towering stack for music that carried the vivid memory of individuals who had long since departed this earth. Catherine held an old record by a classic American crooner in her delicate hands, tracing the cardboard edges with a deep reverence. "May I trust you with a profound truth, Valerie?" the elderly woman signed, her hands moving with a heavy, uncharacteristic slowness. Valerie placed a record into the cabinet and sat down directly across from her. "Of course, Mrs. Montgomery," she responded. "I did not lose my hearing due to a natural medical illness 8 years ago," Catherine signed, her eyes fixed on the vintage record in her lap. "It was a tragic accident. A Sunday morning. Raymond was 33 years old at the time, and he had come to visit me here. We had engaged in a bitter, hurtful argument over the telephone a few days prior regarding his father's estate and his intense obsession with his corporate career. He was incredibly angry when he arrived, and my own pride prevented me from backing down. We shouted terrible things at one another right here in this room. Raymond finally reached his breaking point, turned on his heel, and stormed out, rushing down the grand central staircase much too quickly. I ran after him because I could not bear the thought of him leaving in such anger. On the very last step, my foot caught the edge of the carpet. I tripped and fell violently forward. Valerie felt a cold, suffocating dread settle deep into her stomach as she watched the older woman's hands continue to move through the dim light. I struck the back of my skull against the sharp marble edge of the staircase newel post, Catherine signed, touching the faded scar hidden beneath her white hair. I remained completely unconscious in the hospital for 3 full days. When I finally opened my eyes, the entire world had been plunged into an absolute, terrifying silence. The neurological damage was permanent. Raymond was sitting right next to my bed when I woke up, his eyes bloodshot and his face twisted with an agony I had never seen before. The moment he saw that I was alive, he wept like a broken child. "Did you ever inform him that you fell because you were chasing after him?" Valerie signed, her hands trembling. "No," Catherine signed instantly, her expression fiercely protective. "I told the doctors, and I told Raymond, that I had simply slipped while walking alone later that evening. If I had revealed the truth, that immense weight of guilt would have utterly destroyed his soul. He has carried enough burdens, and I chose to carry the silence alone so that he could remain free." The silence that settled over the second-floor sitting room was heavier than any silence Valerie had ever experienced, broken only by the rhythmic, drumming roar of the rain against the glass. Valerie's eyes were bright with tears as she looked at the magnificent, sacrificial woman sitting before her. "Why are you choosing to share this heavy secret with me tonight?" she signed. "Because you are the only individual in this grand, empty house who truly takes the time to listen to my hands," Catherine responded, her gaze steady and filled with a profound maternal trust. "And because I must ask you to give me your solemn promise that you will never, under any circumstances, reveal this truth to my son." Valerie felt the immense weight of the promise pressing down upon her heart. "Mrs. Montgomery, Raymond has a right to understand the depth of your sacrifice," she signed back. "It would not liberate his mind. It would completely shatter his spirit," Catherine countered with an absolute, immovable finality. "Raymond is a man who takes every single failure and transforms it into a permanent anchor that he drags behind him. I know my son better than anyone else does. He canceled the professional interpreter 3 years ago out of a subconscious need to punish himself, to distance himself from the reality of my condition because it reminded him of his unresolved pain. He must never know." The front door of the mansion echoed from the first floor, followed by the familiar, heavy footsteps of Raymond returning early from his meeting, his coat soaked with rain. Catherine offered Valerie a look that was not a plea for pity, but a profound gesture of absolute confidence. Valerie nodded her head once, sealing the secret within her own heart. The following Wednesday afternoon, the fragile peace of the estate was violently disrupted. Raymond called Valerie into his private first-floor study, his face incredibly tense, and his corporate jacket abandoned on the back of his chair. Irene Vance had called him the previous evening, unleashing a torrent of bitter accusations, claiming that Valerie was utilizing her unique access to Catherine to actively manipulate the elderly woman, poisoning her mind against Irene, and creating a toxic dependency within the household. Raymond stood by his massive mahogany desk, his arms tightly crossed over his chest. "Irene is convinced that you are overstepping your professional boundaries, Valerie," he said, his voice clipped and guarded. "She believes you are extracting private family history for your own personal gain." Valerie did not flinch, nor did she offer a frantic, defensive explanation. She stood completely still, her dark eyes meeting his with an absolute, calm dignity. "And what is it that you truly believe, Raymond?" she asked quietly, utilizing his first name for the very first time. "I am asking you to explain the true nature of the deep conversations you share with my mother," Raymond countered, his defensive corporate mask slipping slightly to reveal a profound vulnerability underneath. "She tells you things that she has hidden from me for 8 long years. I can feel the shift in this house, and I do not understand what is happening behind my back. Your mother shares her true heart with me," Valerie said, "because I am the only person who took the time to speak her language without demanding that she change to fit my convenience. If she has profound opinions about the individuals in her life, those opinions belong entirely to her. I did not place them there." Raymond turned toward the large window, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of his wooden desk. He thought of the terrifying sound of his mother's fall 8 years ago, a sound that had haunted his nightmares, and he looked back at Valerie, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. Was my mother's fall my fault? Did she tell you why she fell? The question was the exact manifestation of the lifelong agony Catherine had sought to prevent. Valerie stood at the crossroads of a devastating truth. She remembered her promise to the mother, and she looked at the broken son standing before her. "I will never betray your mother's personal confidence, Raymond," she said softly, her voice filled with a deep, aching empathy. "But I will tell you this. The answers you are desperately seeking cannot be found in my words. You must find the courage to sit down with your mother, look directly into her eyes, and ask her yourself, using the language you have spent weeks learning. The truth belongs to the two of you, not to me." Raymond Montgomery did not sleep for a single second that night. He spent the dark hours walking through the silent corridors of his family's grand estate, standing for a long time at the base of the central staircase, staring at the marble floor with a profound, aching clarity. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he quietly entered his mother's bedroom, watching her peaceful, white-haired form sleep beneath the soft blue blanket. He realized with a devastating sharpness he had spent 8 years running away from her silence because his own hidden guilt had made him a coward. He returned to his study, opened his sign language application, and spent the remaining hours until dawn practicing 3 specific phrases in front of the mirror, until his hands moved without a single calculation. "I am so sorry. Please forgive me. I love you." At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, he drove his car to the modest apartment building in South Boston, climbing the 4 flights of broken stairs to touch the buzzer of Department 4. When Valerie opened the door, her hair loose and her eyes wide with shock, Raymond did not speak a single vocal word. He stood in the dim hallway, raised his hands, and signed to her with a slow, clumsy, but incredibly beautiful sincerity. "I ended my relationship with Irene last night," his hands declared. "I told her that I cannot spend my life with someone who refuses to learn the language of the people I love. And I spoke with my mother this morning at dawn. I asked her for forgiveness, and she held my hands and told me that she had already forgiven me 8 years ago. I am finally learning how to listen." Valerie looked at his tired, earnest face, and a brilliant smile broke through her exhaustion as she stepped aside, inviting him into her home to share a warm cup of coffee. The intimate wedding took place on a magnificent Saturday afternoon in October, deep within the ancient oak garden of the Brookline estate. The New England sky was an absolute, brilliant blue, and the golden autumn leaves fell gently through the crisp air like a blessing. There were exactly 42 guests present, only the individuals who truly mattered. Valerie's mother had traveled from her rural hometown, sitting in the front row next to Valerie's younger sister Grace, who was weeping tears of pure joy. Lillian and the rest of the domestic staff sat close by, their faces radiant. Catherine sat precisely in the center of the garden, her emerald green silk dress reflecting the elegance of her spirit, her eyes locked onto her son and the young woman who had brought light back into their silent world. When the time arrived for the exchange of vows, Raymond turned his body slightly, so that both Valerie and his mother could see his hands clearly. He signed his lifelong commitment entirely in American Sign Language, translating his own words aloud for the hearing guests, but directing the raw emotion of his fingers to the 2 women who had saved him from himself. "I entered this year completely blind to the music of silence," Raymond signed, his eyes shining with a profound love. "You did not merely teach my hands a new language, Valerie. You taught my soul how to truly hear." Valerie raised her own hands, her movements absolute perfection, as she signed her response, promising to stand by his side through every storm that life might bring, her white dress catching the golden afternoon light. As the small gathering of loved ones raised their hands into the air, waving them joyfully in the beautiful, silent applause of the deaf community, Catherine Montgomery leaned her head back against the ancient oak tree, her heart overflowing with a magnificent, tranquil peace. She looked at her son, whose hands were now intertwined with Valerie's, and she closed her eyes, letting her mind wander through the long, complex journey of her 74 years of life. Listening, she reflected silently within the beautiful, vast sanctuary of her mind. Is an art form that has absolutely nothing to do with the physical mechanism of the human ear. For the first 66 years of my existence, when my world was filled with the constant, loud noise of spoken words, corporate chatter, and the frantic bustle of high society, I often walked through life entirely deaf to the true hearts of the people around me. I had believed that hearing was a passive biological certainty, a tool to navigate the world, rather than an act of deep, intentional love. It was only when the physical sound was violently stripped away from me on that cold Sunday morning 8 years ago, leaving me stranded in a terrifying, heavy silence, that I began to comprehend the profound difference between merely hearing a voice and truly listening to a human soul. True human connection does not require the heavy force of vocal cords or the loud cadence of spoken sentences. It requires an absolute, vulnerable willingness to be entirely present in the sight of another human being. It requires us to drop our defensive corporate masks, to set aside our phones and our busy, strategic schedules, and to look at one another with an honesty that leaves no room for deceit. My son spent 8 long years running away from my silence because he mistakenly believed that my missing hearing was a tragic brokenness that needed to be managed with expensive investments or polite, distant smiles. He did not understand that the glass barrier separating us was not created by my lack of ears, but by his own fear of looking into my eyes and seeing the truth of our shared pain. It was a young woman with a simple apron and a heart shaped by silent love who walked into a loud, exclusive restaurant and showed us that a language spoken with the hands can carry far more warmth, truth, and poetry than any spoken sermon ever delivered. Valerie did not treat my silence as a dark room to be feared or a medical problem to be solved. She treated it as a beautiful, sacred space where 2 human minds could meet as absolute equals. Through her beautiful hands, she unlocked the tightly sealed windows of this grand, empty house, allowing the fresh air of truth to heal a wound that had festered in the darkness for nearly a decade. As I sit beneath these ancient oak trees today, watching my beautiful son stand before the woman who saved us both, his fingers moving with the clumsy, honest grace of a man who has finally discovered his true voice, I realize that my profound deafness was not a heavy curse or a tragic sentence. It was the mysterious, agonizing path that we were required to walk so that we could finally learn how to love one another without the noisy clutter of words. For the truest, most enduring languages of this life are those that require no sound at all, the quiet pressure of a hand in the dark, the shared tears of a long overdue forgiveness, and the silent, radiant smile of a mother who can finally see that her son has found his way home.